Circa 1945, Alan Turing built up computer engineering from the impressively early foundation of such forerunners as Charles Babbage and Ada Lovelace by developing the Turing test, designed to gauge a given machine or program's ability to exhibit intelligent behavior. While this might seem like a funny place to start in a history of video games video, this development was more or less directly responsible for the creation of video games, because without artificial intelligence, you'd just be running down naked corridors with nothing to shoot at, now wouldn't you? Incidentally, today is also Alan Turing's birthday. Happy birthday, Mr. Turing. Don't try to send him a card or something. He's dead. Sad story, actually. You should look it up. Moving right along, though, in 1958, a mere 4 years after Alan Turing's death, a bored physicist, which we all know to be the most dangerous kind of physicist, by the name of William Higginbotham, repurposed an oscilloscope to create what is widely considered to be the first real video game, Tennis for Two. The circuitry for the game took up about the space of a microwave oven and could simulate velocity, drag, whether the ball hit the net, and whether a player had hit it back or not. Because the late 50s were a simpler time, people reportedly lined up by the hundreds to have a crack at it. Despite its popularity, Tennis for Two was on a relatively narrow scope, and so at the time didn't really get to a level higher than amusing things someone did once with one of those newfangled computer things. And it wasn't until a decade later that a German immigrant inventor and toy maker by the name of Ralph Baer created something called the Brown Box in 1968, largely accepted to be the first video game console. Sanders, known as Magnavox, got a hold of it in 1971, and a year later was publicly released as the Magnavox Odyssey. Originally, sales were hurt due to marketing flubs and people believing that it only worked on Magnavox TVs, but after all that was sorted out, it turned out to be their most profitable product in ever. They would go on to patent just about everything about the thing and make gobs of money hand over fist from suits from Atari and others. You might not have heard of Ralph Baer much, even if you had heard of him and his Brown Box, but Baer never stopped creating. He actually created Simon and continues to make toys and games to this day, and even donated all of his early designs and prototypes to the Smithsonian. So, go you, Mr. Baer. If Ralph Baer's Brown Box and all the new competition is spawned by the first generation of console gaming, then Atari 2600 kicked off the second generation and also started the first real console war, because we can't have something and not also have a war about it eventually. If you've only just lightly dusted this kind of history before, you've probably heard of this one, and maybe even were under the impression that it started here. It didn't. It just got really, really crazy big here. Atari had come out with the 2600 in 1977 to complete with a product called the Video Entertainment System, released by Fairchild Semiconductor. Atari quickly not only beat them out, but nearly erased them with titles such as Combat, Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and of course Pong, which they were sued for by Magnavox. At this point it wasn't a real war as much as it was kind of a slaughter. Oh, and as a brief aside, some little no-name company started releasing these little one-shot handheld games called Game & Watch. I think they were called Nintendo? I think? The point started to tip when Mattel came out with the Intellivision in 1980, which kicked off Atari and Mattel airing a string of shameless ads slamming each other and telling people how much more awesome they were, respectively. Pretty much par for the course from 1980s television. That's not to say that stuff like this wasn't happening before the Intellivision. The market was absolutely saturated with new consoles coming out every year. These two just chose to focus on one another, as Mattel was actively trying to poach Atari's sales, and vice versa. I actually couldn't find anything referencing the kind of rabid fanboyism we saw in the mid-late 80s and all throughout the 90s. This doesn't necessarily suggest that it didn't exist, but it was still more or less a time when video games were considered solely for kids, and any sort of true cultural rivalry was likely broadly ignored. I should also take a moment to mention that while we've been talking pretty exclusively about console gaming, don't let that fool you into thinking that was the only thing going on. 1980 also saw the release of games like Ultima, Richard Garriott's Super Baby, as well as the creation of an entire subgenre, roguelikes, based on the game released in that year, Rogue. PC gaming was happening, thriving, and quite active pretty much since around Turing's time, but it was mostly done by hobbyists and distributed by hand in small groups, so it was harder to get any real kind of documentation on. Make no mistake, PC gaming was a thing well before and around console gaming, but it doesn't really see the same kind of huge legitimacy until later. That being said, PC gaming was on the cutting edge, including the first popularly known use of pseudo 3D graphics using vector graphic wireframes to make tanks in Battlezone, and starting to bring up steam for adventure games as we know it with Zork, known as one of the first and earliest interactive fiction games. Meanwhile, arcades hit their golden age in 1978 after riding and creating waves and would start appearing just about everywhere as they proliferated corners next to movie theaters, restaurants, and schools, and for a while became just about as common a sight as Starbucks is today. Then something horrible happened. The Great North American Video Game Crash of 1983. Remember when I was talking about how the console market was saturated with a bunch of little companies shouting me too, with their consoles and games? There was too much to buy and not enough buyers, and worse, a lot of what there was to sell wasn't very good. The most famous example of this was Atari's notorious E.T. game, which was so bad and sold so poorly that it led to the actually true urban legend that they buried all of their unsold copies somewhere in the middle of the New Mexican desert. Console sales plummeted, dozens of games simply halted development, and it just about killed arcades out, period, golden age and all. Anyone who had seen the rise of video gaming here surely thought they'd also seen the death, and so by and large, everyone was prepared to accept another fad passing and move on with their horribly whoring lives. Clearly, though, the story does not end here. I've still got something like 11 pages of script left, and like hell am I going to waste it all. For the next part in the series, be sure to check back next week when I'll be posting part 2 of a brief history of video games, and talk about who and what brought gaming back from the brink. And in the meantime, why don't you head over to our home blog? This blog is unreview.blogspot.com. I'm sure you'll have a great time there. We have clowns. Not the scary kind. Is there a not scary kind? Well, I certainly hope so, because we have them. Until then, I'm Tom at Edit Review, and I'll see you next time.